with us two aliens from another planet who have parachuted into our space, and right, and they've been with us for the last 3 or 4 days. And so, really, I wanted to start by asking each of them questions on what kind of themes did you pick up in this conversation? Start with identifying themes, and then we'll move into a little bit on what you see as sort of going forward steps this community might be ready for. Dana, why don't I start with you?
So as the Martian who landed and then got to address everyone right off the bat, I'll just say this is self-serving, but one of the themes that's come back again and again is the theme of humility and intellectual humility and the openness to the possibility that we might be wrong. And I have just loved hearing that in the breakout groups, in sessions, in other conversations, and I'm really excited about the idea of that theme being just sort of coming back again and again. Another theme that I don't know if folks are speaking in these terms, but the way that I see it, because I'm so focused on the concept of social identity and our team memberships, one of the other themes that I've seen is the idea of people in this room recognizing the need to expand the circle of what constitutes their own team identity and their own social identity. Even when we were working on the COVID-19 sort of acknowledgement and apology, ultimately what that would do psychologically is expand the circle of what that team is and say, we're actually all on the same team. That we all have shared interests. We're recognizing that there was a breach because we were not perceiving ourselves as being on the same team as you. We're recognizing that now. Let's all come to the table and let's share let's have shared norms and values moving forward. So those are some that I've...
Those are a couple. Tony?
Yeah. So I would echo a lot of the same ones. I think, but maybe coming at it in inverse order, I would add a couple too. So one thing that struck me was this issue of the role of professionals and experts in these large systems and how to think about balancing the face-to-face interactions with the larger systems and the extent to which and how we can think about fixing large problems, the issue of too big to fix. That really struck me as a kind of through line. And related to that is the issue of responsibility or culpability for when there are breaches of trust. We talked about that in our COVID group, but it's come up in a lot of the other discussions as well. So to the extent that there's a breach, how do we think about responsibility for that? And I think this links up with the issue of sort of system and individual, because often no individual is fully responsible for that breach. Sometimes they're historical, sometimes they take place elsewhere in these large institutions, but nevertheless, there's a sense in which there's a shared kind of responsibility of a kind. So really thinking about what that looks like in practice to try to acknowledge and rectify it. I also was struck by this humility theme too, and one kind of concept term I might introduce that I think is helpful. So you talked about the identity group, coming at it from the point of view of expertise and competence. There's a concept, a term from the continental legal tradition called competence, which I think is kind of useful. So this is the idea, like a court has the competence to decide, competence to decide what kinds of cases it can hear, right? So it's what's in bounds, what's not. It's a sort of meta level question. So like obviously courts have legal competence to decide a given case, but who decides what cases get heard, right? I think there's an analog in the realm of expertise, and we spent a lot of time in thinking about COVID, I think circling around this issue. It's like, different experts have competence, but do they have the competence to say where that runs out and where other kinds of expertise, whether formal or experience-based, become important? And then thinking about what we can do about that, right? How do we institutionalize better decision-making processes? So those are just a couple
Love that.
thoughts.
Let's go.
So following up on this, experts, humility, people who are being put forward for having or putting themselves forward for having special competence, for having special training, for having a special set of skills, and who are often turned to, as in the pandemic, but other situations, for guidance of tell us what to do. You're an expert, you know. Reflect on what you heard about guidance for experts to manage humility and still be experts. What does that look like?
One of the things that I find fascinating about the communication of science more broadly is that science is at what I call a rhetorical disadvantage when communicating findings because of all the incentives of the media environment and the communication environment really are working against scientists, right? Because what we talked about before with regards to the media environment really privileging confidence and bluster and not necessarily humility and caveats and scope conditions and boundary conditions, et cetera. I learned that very early on, by the way, when I was doing an interview with BBC and they kept saying, so you found that this causes that. And I said, well, no, it's correlational data and there are all these other possible confounding variables. And he was so frustrated.
Moving on to the next.
And it never aired. It never made it to air. And I was like, I see how this works. Oh. So, but what I think is important about that, though, and the way that I've sort of translated that in my own recommendations for the communication of science is what if scientists and experts tapped into a lay epistemological orientation and instead of trying to keep it in the realm of here's what the data say, here's what this controlled trial said, et cetera, what if they used the same kinds of cues that normal people use and say, look, I'm a person and I'm drawing upon my experience in the world. It just so happens that my experience is that I study this a lot and I've been overwhelmed by the evidence about this. And so as an individual engaging with the world, my experience is telling me that this is the course of action that I would favor. And I recognize that that's a violation of sort of the way that scientists and medical professionals go about their business. But think about how compelling that would be to normal muggles, to normal people, to say, where it's like, look, I'm just like you, I'm just drawing upon my experience in the world to make a decision. It just so happens that my experience involves reading a lot of these dusty journals and being in a lab. And so here's what I feel is what's going on now, but I could always be wrong.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So I kind of, maybe to complement that rhetorical point, I think there is the question of the competence as well, right? And I think sometimes, when we're dealing with I guess we're sort of talking here about, policy decision-making context, which is, I realize not the only thing that we've talked about over the course of several days. But in those situations, there's a question, I think about what the role of the expert really is. Is it just to point to the data? Or is it to offer a recommendation? And I think one of the things we talked about in our discussion groups was the complicated relationships between value judgments and epistemic, purely sort of scientific judgments. And I think there is a rhetorical aspect to this too, where the recognition that in this role I'm being asked, or I think that it's my obligation to give a kind of recommendation, to a normative judgment. Here's what I think the right answer based on this expertise. But that's not the only kind of expertise that might be important. And I think reframing expert advice in terms of judgment rather than the deductive conclusion of an argument, right? Like, we have the data, and so we just know that this follows, which is, of course, almost never true, would be very helpful. But it's not, I would say, not purely rhetorical, too, because there is a sort of underlying recognition that role has its limits, and it needs to be integrated into a larger deliberative process with other kinds of judgments.
Tony, you talked about the difference between authority and power, and of course that's in sociological theory, but in real language here for clinicians, for medical authority, one of the lines that we seem to be struggling with is our authority is vested with power in the current culture, that that we're the ones who are licensed to get paid by Medicare. We're the ones who are licensed to authorize testing. So there is a special place that physicians have, that licensure confers, nurses have it in various ways. What do you think about, as a profession that gets vested not just with authority, but also power, how are folks supposed to navigate that?
Yeah, and I think it's a very thorny problem. What I wouldn't want to suggest is that you can totally decouple authority and power. Okay. And authoritative institutions certainly have and need to exercise power, right? And by power there, I mean something like the capacity to effectuate a change. And that's usually exercised through an institution, right? So institutions do that all the time, and they have to. I think where it becomes tricky is when institutions trade on their authority to exert power in domains in which they may not actually have authority. And I think there's a tendency that when an institution feels threatened, when its authority is really or perceived to be under threat, that they respond by exercising power. And you can't acquire authority through power, even if authoritative institutions do have power, need to use it, right? And so that's I think, the problem that I'm interested in. And I think in complicated, messy scenarios like we have now, where really complicated information ecosystems, the traditional gatekeeping functions of a lot of expert institutions really are weakened. There's a tendency, it's a sort of understandable psychological tendency, I think, on the part of institutions to respond to that by wanting to exert control. But what they really need to do is sustain or reestablish their authority and what the appropriate domain of their power is. So I don't know, that's sort of a philosophical response, but there are the limits of it, yeah.
Especially the limits of it.
Correct, yeah.
I'll ask you one more follow-up question on that, because the other word you used was legitimacy.
Yeah.
And what, we clearly have different paths to legitimacy than we used to have. As you think about professions establishing legitimacy, what does that look like? Because the authority comes from legitimacy, which generates power. Where does legitimacy come from?
So I would, at the risk of repeating what I would try to do in my little talk the other day, I would point to competence and character as two necessary components of legitimacy. But I also think there's another aspect to it, which you brought up in our discussions, Rich, around the sort of political dispensation that expert institutions have implicitly. That to the extent, there are lots of ways to arrange societies, right? And we were talking to someone last night about this, like, we have a legal system that operates a certain way. Like, we've made a decision to delegate certain kinds of decision making to legal institutions, or we have, a jury of peers that, assess matters of fact, and we have legal experts that assess matters of law and judges, and that system's obviously not perfect, but it's a way of managing uncertainty and legitimacy. And I think there's an analogous situation with scientific medical expert institutions, particularly insofar as they exercise political power or influence. And I think a recognition of that is very important. And I think one of the things we're seeing now is that political legitimacy is under strain. And I think there is a tendency sometimes on the part of experts in those institutions not to recognize that political dispensation component. So that might be another way to think about it. So I'm really just riffing off of your insight there.
Fair enough. Well, so Dana, you shared with us that framework of comprehension, control, community. How about legitimacy and authority in that framework? What should experts be thinking about? How do we exploit, I don't know if exploit is the right word.
Probably the wrong word, Rich.
How do we build on, thank you.
Welcome.
How do we build on that? How do we use that to
capitalize on.
I'm not sure that's any better.
Maybe not. Definitely not exploit.
Yeah, definitely. Right. How do we develop? How do we build on?
Well, what's so great, I think, has come through in these conversations, though, is that even, and through my work, is that even if the need for comprehension and need for control and need for community are all things that drive our meaning-making process, Community is sort of the umbrella one that informs all three. And so when you're thinking, I mean, when I think about these issues of legitimacy and authority, I'm very much thinking about them in the context, almost like a sociological context. Like, how do individuals think of themselves vis-a-vis these institutions? Do they think of these institutions as protective of their social group? Do they think of these institutions as part, like out-group members? Because I think that is, in sort of a primal way, that is how people are orienting to institutions. Because as much as institutions are sort of abstract concepts, at the end of the day, institutions are people. They are roles played by people. And I think that individuals know that, and the individuals who they interact with from within those institutions have an outsized role to play, obviously, in shaping perceptions of legitimacy, et cetera. But so I guess all that is to say that the comprehension and control elements are most certainly going to be they're going to be thought through the lens of, are these institutions, do I picture these institutions as having my team's interests at heart or not?
Yeah.
Right. And clearly, I'm going to ask you the last question for each of you, which is kind of the money question. Being a trustworthy professional in an untrusting world, that's the environment in which we're having this conversation. And a lot of what we are meant to be doing as professionals, and we talked about this a little bit last night, we're offering help. We're saying we're interested in your predicament, in your challenge. And we've talked a lot about the way that scale has happened, that we're not just talking about community doctors and individual practices and people knowing each other. We're talking about huge health systems. We're talking about insurance companies. We're talking about aggregated players. How do we, if you were offering 2 or 3 pieces of advice, each of you, to a group of professionals leading institutions or being professionals themselves, what should they be focusing on to become more trustworthy in this very skeptical world that we have?
First of all, I would think I would not approach it as a communication strategy.
Okay.
I would not approach it as a sort of messaging campaign. Because if you're thinking about it as a communication strategy or a messaging campaign, you're missing the point. I think thinking in terms of honoring the fact that every individual has autonomy and dignity and is trying desperately to just get through the day, understanding the world, feeling like they have some kind of agency within it, and feeling like they're part of a social group of allies who has their backs, and recognizing that all of us are doing that. And also recognizing that even if that is resulting in individuals being distrusting of their own institutions or believing in misinformation, honoring where that is coming from and not judging it, but trying to find common ground. The other thing that we haven't talked about this whole time, which has been kind of interesting, is the concept of authenticity. I think as much as we are in an untrusting world right now, we're also in a world where authenticity is king. Unfortunately, authenticity can be performed, and some people are really good at pretending they're authentic, and that is dangerous. However, I think leaning into one's authentic self, even in these positions of authority or power, could go a long way. And in fact, that's part of what intellectual humility is. It's an element of authenticity. It's recognizing the limits of one's knowledge and being open about that. And there is a certain authenticity to that.
That's a wonderful word to hear from you and for us to be reflecting on. What does it look like to do that in leadership? What does it look like to do that in an institutional context as well as an individual context? Tony?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that. I guess what I would say is that, we've talked about policy changes, larger kinds of structural reforms and so on, and that's all obviously important. But I also think, though, that recognizing as an individual, asking what is my role here now in this particular role? We all have multiple roles that we fulfill, right? We're complex social creatures, but as a professional, as a physician, as a policy advisor, whatever, what is my role here now? And what are the obligations that attend to that? And it is, I think, overwhelming to think about changing these large systems. But at the end of the day, institutions are people, and we're people that have certain roles to play. And so we do have to think at that human level, that sort of re-embedding idea that I mentioned the other day. And as a part of that, I think recognizing that the kinds of competencies, I refer to norms that inform expertise in given roles, also function to restrain us in ways, to make us accountable to others and to standards that standards that are common to social group in some way. I think that's another important aspect of that. So that may be fairly abstract advice, but maybe a starting point.
You put out a wonderful vision in your talk yesterday where you described the alternative between showing up with a plan and for trust building being about trying to sell people your plan.
Yeah.
You described
Communication strategy.
how do you, that's exactly what you were just calling out. How do you make the whole process of developing the plan an engagement, a piece of engagement work? Well, we are at time. I want to thank both of you for coming out of your world and into ours.